Well, good evening, everybody. Here we are again at the Cable Easel. This is Pat Windrow, sitting down this time, just back from Virginia, where I went for an extended weekend and came back more a landscape painter than ever. So, with the information for you that I'm going to be gone for next Tuesday's program, maybe this will be shown again a week from tonight, but it will be rebroadcast on Saturday at 4 o'clock, unless, of course, there's some fantastic other thing that will preempt it. Also, the phones are not available this evening, therefore we won't have any questions to be answered for you. However, save your questions for the next time that I'm on, and let me talk for a moment about what I'm going to do tonight. I've brought a prepared canvas with a darker tone on it than the white, which is usually the way you buy them in the store, because it does bad things to the transmission when they're too white. So I've pre-coated it with a darker color. I'm going to be working from a small sketch, which I did right here in the area, and because people ask me always, how do you do water? I thought that I would do once again a water study. This is an area which I have known for a long time, and as soon as anybody wants to zero in on this, I'll show you how I begin to lay this out for your information. I will attempt to keep talking to you for the next hour because I'll try to anticipate what questions might be asked, seeing as how we don't have a phone. So I'm going to show you how I lay this out. I'm using some thinner, a small brush as to be used as a pencil, very much like a pencil. I'm just going to lay this out. I've done this a few times before, but I think that it's always a good idea to work on something with which I am sort of really familiar with, so that I can, give you the information as succinctly as possible. This is, I think I've started this off a little bit too large, so I'm going to show you what we painters do when we have made a mistake. We wash it off and we start over again. This is perfectly acceptable, because when you're out there in the wild, as it were, you certainly should feel free to start over if you think you have made a mistake. I'm going to start by telling you that my sketch does not have as much sky in it as I'm going to put on this evening, because my canvas this evening is going to be is a rectangle as opposed to a very long canvas sketch from which I'm working. So because of the difference in proportion and shape, I'm simply going to add sky to it. When you're working from sketches, if you've decided that you don't want to continue with the shape that you began with, you must modify it. So here is the way I lay out a landscape. I get the motif, and then the painting of it. Oh, I got to make that a little bit longer. So let's try to rework that again. This is going to be very illustrative of the fact that I say, without learning a little bit, or even a great deal, about drawing, it is difficult, and it's also almost impossible to start painting right away. There are other programs that discount the need to paint, but I certainly feel that that is a disadvantage to tell people that you don't have to know how to draw, just start right in and paint. That's not the way it works. You've got to understand something about perspective and drawing. This can be done by being observant, by, if you are not confident enough in your own self-teaching ability, then get books on perspective and general techniques. There are many, many very good ones in all art stores, and it is the same as a carpenter starting out without a hammer. You've got to have the tools. The tools are the understanding of the importance of drawing. So, as I have said for an awfully long time, without it, you are just floundering around in the dark, and that makes it frustrating. It also makes people give up before they should, and that's not right. Well, I also feel that the business of drawing, this should be taller. See, I'm just correcting things all over the place. This should be a little bit taller. You can see how you can correct it. It is not right to tell people that all of this is easy and takes place almost without trying. It doesn't. You have to correct, and you have to, be observant. All right, now that's the motif in the foreground here, in this middle ground, is what is going to determine the proportion of the background. So I'm going to lay out the mirror image of what this is going to be, and just line it up so that we know that the images that are going to take place are going to be an important part of this composition. Reflections, when you're dealing with water, are part of the composition in a very important way. So when you lay out the picture, don't ever forget that the reflections must be given a very important role. So, well, it's fun to do this kind of thing, which is live, because there are people who sometimes don't realize that we're live and on the air. They go running around through the halls with all sorts of loud voices, which sometimes is heard by the audience. And so we just had somebody apparently running out with something in mind. All right, this is a general layout of how you begin a landscape. The important thing, of course, is the laying out and the determining where these shapes are going to go. Here is my palette. It looks like a very neat palette to me. To some people, it would fill them with horror to see such a messy palette. However, that's the way they're supposed to look, and I'm using a basic white here for the mixture of, I'm going to do a very, very pale sky, and that is mixed with a touch of cerulean blue, some pure white, and you'll see how pale this is compared to the prepared ground that I have brought. But I think that one of the charming things about a Long Island landscape is the fact that there is so much muted tones here. There is a wonderful pale quality to the sky at this time of year that becomes even paler towards the horizon. I'm using a large brush of nylon bristles. This is not a sable brush. It's nylon. It's perfectly all right. My board is a canvas board. This I acquired because of a very generous thought on the part of one of my viewers called Ann Mishak. She told me that there was a nice sale down in Patchogue on these boards, and I went down there and sure enough found the sale, for which I'm very grateful for the information. And that's what this program should be, is a dispensing of information to people who are interested in this painting and drawing. You can see that the paint is quite thin, and it's making little drips here and there. That's okay, as long as you don't get it on a finished work. All of this is going to be painted down in the foreground and the middle ground, so the little drips can be taken care of. And besides that, when you are working with something else besides a 4-inch house brush, you can expect to drip a little bit here and there, and the sky application should be done with small strokes, not with great big things running across like that. I think maybe we ought to pull back just a little tiny bit so that we can see a little bit more of an overall picture of how you handle this large sky area. And we're going to, the putting on of this, it takes some time, and it also means that the painter and the student must learn what it means to give it time. None of these things can be done in a slapdash fashion with large shortcuts, such as wide brushes and sponges and things like that. It should be done with a brush, a real show-enough artist's paintbrush, and put on in small areas at a time. It gives an interest to the texture. It also gives it a painterly quality as opposed to looking like you're painting the wall of a living room. And as you can see, it has nice gradations of color. I'm coming down towards the horizon and introducing a small amount of pale color, namely some white with a little bit of what my tube calls red-orange, but there's so little that you can't even make it out. It is also mixed a little bit with the blue, which tempers the red-orange quality to it. Now, we have a general overall tone, very pale. It looks much darker on the monitor than, bluer on the monitor than what I see. And now I'm going to do the clouds and talk once again about clouds and the fact that clouds are rarely white. This may come across white, but it really isn't. And the tops of clouds are what show, because that's where the light strikes. The light hits the tops of these miraculous things called clouds, and the rest of them fade into the rest of the sky, unless it's a different and strange weather pattern, which will give sometimes a darker tone to the bottom of the cloud. But in the summertime, such as now, the clouds do disappear into the color of the sky. So you do that by putting your light color on at the top of the cloud, determining the shape. And of course, clouds change all the time, so your shape can be determined almost in a creative manner. What I'm trying to do is to tell you about the technique of cloud painting. Down here, where the sky is a little bit paler, you can use an even more bright tone, and even if it's very subtle and barely shows, that's the way it ought to be. It should not be puffy-looking things that look like little lambs that are running across the sky. They should be a little bit puffy, a little bit subtle, and sometimes kind of indeterminate. Don't put too many clouds in. That's just too much of a good thing. So, we have now what is probably all that you need to do to worry about the sky. As you can see, it's a little bit, I'm going to do this and show you that it is wet. You can see the reflections, and therefore, I'm not going to do the birds yet until the until the paint dries a trifle. Of course, you work from the most distant point to the foreground, and so the next most distant point after the sky and the clouds is the very distant background, which should be extremely pale, and I'm going to be mixing it here. Probably a touch of this really lethal purple mixed with a little bit of yellow and some raw sienna. This gives a kind of an indeterminate mauvish fade into the background kind of color to be kept very subtle at all times. That's not mauve enough. Hang on. We need to put a little bit more mauve in there. And every time I see a mauve range in the background, I say, how's that possible that this is actually really truly mauve? And it is. So don't be shy if you think that there's what some people call this violet, but it is. It's got that quality. Long Island has that beautiful hazy quality to it, especially when it's as bloody hot as it is today. And just believe what you see. If you say you see yourself, it's not possible that anything is that mauve, an Easter egg mauve almost. It is possible, and it certainly makes for interesting, wonderful color studies. There is light, of course, coming and striking that distant meadow, which is the preserve down there on at West Meadow Beach, and the top of the meadow becomes light and sunstruck, albeit that meadow is really, well, I wonder what kind of grass. I think it starts with an SP. Spartina grass, I believe, is what this meadow is in the distance. To be paid attention to, because this is the characteristic of our area. The Spartina grass is, of course, everywhere in the globe, but we have a wonderful bunch of it right here on the island in all of these marshlands. Now, while I'm in the area, I'm going to just very barely indicate. Oh, good. Here we go. Close up. Here's a nice close-up coming up of how you handle these distant trees. You handle them with almost nothing. They become almost a part, sort of silhouetted against that distant, it's not a mountain range, God knows, no, Long Island doesn't have any mountain ranges, but against that ridge. This is known as Crane's Neck back there. And it does sort of, because the North Shore has got its nooks and crannies of hilly places. You can, in fact, find ridges and nice elevations. The South Shore, of course, is absolutely lacking in them entirely. So we have this, and it's very subtle and should not have any great big deal made out of it. The ridge that comes down here, according to my sketch, which you can see, we'll hold it up later, is darker because it's closer to you. This has got to be kept very pale, and this one can now become much more focused and darker in tone because it's closer. By darker in tone, I am adding more sienna, more ultramarine blue. I'm not using green of any kind. I'm using blues and yellows and sienna. Raw sienna and yellow ochre. All of these are what make for the subtlety of color which we're after. Now, because the sun has been striking the tops of these clouds, it also strikes the tops of the trees in the distance. But this has to be done very, very subtly and almost unpainted. So let's see if I can put it in and then show you what I mean by unpainting it after I've got it in. Now this is approximately as much as I think we ought to show. And now I'm going to unpaint it and get rid of it. It has to be almost imperceptible. The business of putting huge amounts of very pale or white or whatever highlights on the sides of trees is a no-no for a landscape painter. It must be done very carefully, and certainly less is better. Less is more at this point. And if you see that if it's really clobbering you, just get rid of it. When you're working in oils, that's easy. You can get rid of it by simply getting rid of it and scrumbling it, as painters like to say. We have then the opportunity of having more wonderful sunlight striking the top of this Spartina grass meadow, which is nearer, therefore probably even more color struck than the distant one, because we're not dealing with atmosphere. And so when you have something as lucky as a beautiful, brilliant yellow-green area, be sure to keep the color absolutely pure and just as bright, and sometimes, now you're going to be surprised, sometimes possibly brighter than what you see. It's called drama. It's also called creating a picture. The outside changes so rapidly with the sun and all the atmospheric conditions that you can take liberties. And if the sun, for instance, hits this brilliantly, do it that way and leave it, because in a half an hour or so it might not be that brilliant. The sun might disappear. So as long as I've got that color in my brush, I'm going to run over to this side and just sketch in it's kind of like an ad lib, because I don't want to make a big point of these. They're far away. They're also sort of in a kind of a shady spot, and they can use only a little bit of modeling, or just a little bit of shading, with the color that I have left on my canvas, on my palette, from the area on the right here. So let me also just sketch in, almost not at all. This lesson will probably be called How You Don't Paint a Landscape, because I am doing a lot of non-painting here. apparently the thing which people like about my painting of landscapes is the fact that they are very subtle, and I try to keep whatever time of day I'm working in clear, and I'm also trying to insinuate an environment. The colors of our Long Island environment, even though we have sky and land and grass and trees, just the way you have in Italy and just the way you have California and China, there is a different atmosphere about these different places. So when that's why I paint on location, don't rely on my memory, because I try to capture the funny peculiarities of the place. And when I do go abroad, or when I go to Virginia, such as I did last weekend, and Florida, which I'm going to do next week, I come back with the information that tells me that even though there are all the same types of things, they are different here. So, now, if we get back for a second, and I'll tell you that we are now working ourselves toward the foreground. Well, that's a nice shot. That shows me and shows the proportion and the size of the picture. The picture now is probably more clearly evident to you in its size by having me as a size reference. That's called a point of reference. Well, here, because this is an old building, you would kind of use the oldness of the building as an atmosphere or as a characteristic of where we are, and concentrate on the fact that that is a roof that may be less than perfect. Maybe it dokes in the middle a little bit, if there's such a word as doke, and it has seen better days, and it's also a kind of the color has faded since it was first put up, I'm sure, and also it's a favorite roosting place for seagulls, and there are usually some stains along the roof here from the presence of those seagulls that come and sit up there. But as I say to you, the simplicity with which you paint landscapes is to be remembered. I think that too many complicated, when I hear of people learning how to paint from teachers, I'm always struck by the fact that teachers try to teach things too complicated. They do not concentrate on the simplicity with which one must paint landscapes. It is important to learn that the tiresome adage that less is more is very, very important in the observation of landscape painting. This, of course, is not. I've gone and given you the outside of the edge of the building, and the roof is much longer. It extends past the wall of the building. That's what probably gives it its nice characteristic. Now, because all roof lines cast a shadow, the mere presence of this shadow is going to tell you that the roof extends far out from the wall of the building by the size of the shadow which is cast. I'm trying to get this color. I'm having problems with the color because it's kind of a funny one. The color of the shadow, the size of the shadow tells you how far out that roof extends past the wall of the building. Something that maybe people don't realize, but when you are a landscape painter, you have to remember that. This is, of course, also the shadow which I laid out before, and as long as I have the color on my brush, I'm going to put it in right now. I'm afraid my shadow is a little bit too dark up there, so you lighten it. And the side of the building, which is in the shadow side of the building, is the same color as the shadow. Although this is a kind of a whitish gray, tattered building, it will not show pure white at this stage of its lifetime. Its lifetime is now. It's asbestos shingling, and it's had all sorts of years of wear on it, and it's faded. So we have the subtlety that the side of this building here is paler than the shadow, and then the front of that building, of course, is light, and it goes up here. I had to heighten the building because it was a mistake in drawing. Well, I do the landscapes because, first of all, I am a landscape painter, as everybody knows, and some children, I meet children in the supermarket, and they say, why do you always paint flowers? Well, I am unaware that I paint as many flowers as apparently the children notice, even though I try to have a variety of lessons here. I apparently paint many, many flowers, and the business of landscape painting becomes very interesting at this time of year. So, maybe we'll do more landscape painting in the summertime months, and then rely on the flowers for wintertime compositions, which is, of course, what I do in my own studio. I believe that there is a roof line that is pale green here. Well, we'll check on that a little bit later. So we have actually, you see, just flat planes of color. This is certainly hardly what you might call an overworked roof painting. It's just a gray. This is an off-whitish thing. This is all flat colors. Something very, it is very valuable to know that these flat colors make a painting, because many times amateurs or people who are just beginning to paint say, but I can't do all those details. The details are the things to be avoided and be kept very simple. What you are after is the overall patterns of the subject matter. I'm dripping on the thing. Now here comes the brilliance of the water, and as you can see, I had to save that amount of brilliance. If I'd made the clouds any brighter, this water wouldn't have been as shiny as it appears to be now. These are things to remember as you paint, because contrast is also a vital part of the business of applying color. So, here, underneath this, even though you may wonder why, this is a grassy area behind the building, which, according to the sketch that I brought home, is where your pilings are against this pale part here. And I'm putting those in first before the pilings. They also have darkness down towards the land where they're growing. And they also become very much in shade here, so there's very little to really see. These are all observations that can only come when you work from life. I am preparing the area for the pilings of the house, putting the water in as well as the grassy area, and because you must underpaint and prepare for the details in the front. The water is now becoming less brilliant than it is over here because it is coming closer to you, and it's a phenomenon that happens only when you're out there observing, and you look at it carefully and you realize the water is darker toward me than it is far away. I'm always anxious to prove my point, so as the painting progresses, I will talk about the business of what water does as it comes toward you. The light is caught brilliantly in the distance. All right, we now are going to, I'm going to change a brush and pick up a brush with which to do the pilings. Now, they can be rendered very simply with a minimum of effort, because what you're after is an impression of what you see. Let's see. Okay, where are those? Yeah, all right. So this little building. Oh, I must prepare this. This ground here. Just a minute. Don't go away. We have not prepared the ground down here soon enough, and we have to do that so that I can get the pilings properly and done with a minimum of effort. because painting should be like singing. It should look simple. It should look easy, and it is sort of when you know what you're doing as far as the preparation of grounds. Now, these pilings are, of course, old. They are not even. They are crooked in spots, and they are sitting on a dark ledge, a platform, and underneath this building all sorts of things happen. Some are fallen, some have gotten loose, some are actually leaning against one another, and it's wonderful because one wonders, how does that building stay standing? Except that it does. Well, we have here, and of course the bottom of the building casts a very intense shadow underneath it, which all blends into the pilings themselves. It all becomes a kind of a silhouetted thing. Naturally, when I finish putting the water in down below there, you will see that the pilings will have to be repeated. Now, we have some windows which we'll just put in and indicate them very simply. Just little squares, and if one needs to make them more interesting later, you can surround them with their little pale color of whatever they're painted. And the door, because it's in a shady area, can be done almost in a sketchy manner. The charm of these places is that they do have rough spots on them, which makes the painting interesting. I'm always looking for things which have architectural mistakes, either from the years or from weather. And I'm preparing the underneath part of this because the pilings under this part of the building appear to be gray as opposed to dark. They are there. Nice, subtle kind of variations that come from the wonderful thing of painting from life. This roof line here is casting a rather intense shadow in this manner, and that roof line tells you that this roof is broken. That shadow is telling you that that roof is broken, which I think is always very amusing, that we can record a broken roof without even painting it. This is a little balcony, can be done just in the simplest silhouette form, and below it is another sort of an arrangement of, well, darks and lights, and there's a barrel outside here, and there's a clothesline, and I'll put that in a little bit later. But all of these things, as you can see, are interpretations. There is a missing bunch of asbestos tiles here, kind of making but that's too much, so you have to unpaint that. That's just too harsh. It has to be much more subtle than that. Get all that out in there. All right, so now you've got this background here, ready to assume the painting of the bush in the foreground. Now the top of the bush, of course, is just like the top of the clouds. It catches the light. And then it becomes suddenly much darker because it folds under, away from the top. There are other instructional programs that say that all the highlights go on the same side of all the places, and all you have to do is to either pick the left or the right side of any given object, give it a little bit of light, and that becomes a highlight. Well, that's not so at all. The highlights must emanate from somewhat the same place, but they also are tricky. They have a way of hitting things that you don't expect. Now there is a nice light area being shot down here. Oh, I better put some sort of pinkish on there because it's actually the beach. It's not grass, it's the beach. You can see that the need to keep things brilliant when the sun is shining comes by observing, when you're out there, where the brilliant places are. And they are very tricky. It's it's never really quite the same. As a matter of fact, it changes during the time that you're sitting there painting. It will change as the hours go by, and you will find all of a sudden that there is the shadow that you thought was under that bush is now no longer there. But don't panic and don't change anything, because once you've established the position of a shadow, you must leave it. It's dangerous to change in mid-path. So whatever you've chosen as a time of day, and then if you haven't had the time to finish it, go home and go back the next day at the same hour. This is a tricky thing to do, especially when you're dealing with tides, because tides have a way of being at different times the next day. And if you have then been painting, let's say at 2 in the afternoon, and the tide is a certain level, the next afternoon the tide is not at that level anymore, and it kind of messes up the whole business of light. But you learn to cope with it. And besides, as somebody said to me, the people who are looking at this picture weren't there at the time, and they have no way of being able to say you were wrong, which is a great escape hatch for the painter who finds himself in trouble with lighting problems. Now, when you have an area which is all simple and all plain and just nothing but a whole bunch of sand, that's what you do. Just put that in and don't worry about thinking, well, that's dull and so on. It's got to be that way. There's a boat sort of lying here. See, I'll get my smaller brush later. I'd like to go back to the reflections here, because this is this is one of the reasons for this whole picture. The business of painting the reflections. Now, under this building, the water is the same, reflects the color that's above it. In other words, this pale green is going to be reflected sort of in the water. The water is naturally a mirror. Under this bush, you're going to find the green of that bush. Directly under here is where the water is going to be colored, the color of the darker because of the advent of that bush under there. I'm using a minimum of a paint at this point because I'm dealing in a thin technique. Water is so subtle that it needs to be handled in a very subtle manner, as well as the clouds. So we have, now that's too yellow. So let me see if I can just green that up a little. That's too blue. I have to green that up a little bit. And so here we have the preparation of this water. According to the sketch that I did, the water becomes darker here. Probably something to do with the fact that this building is casting some shadows on the water. And that's why I say that unless you work from life, there is no guessing how all of this happens. This darkness here has got to come from that building. It's got to be dark here. And it will eventually just absorb itself into the foreground. It just sort of fades off and becomes nothing, and then turns into just the water. Reflections have a way of simply going as far as they want to and then disappearing. Now the side of this building is kind of, well, it's got some mauve in it, and that should be probably very close, to get as close as you can to that. And here is the side of this building. As you can see, my eye is running down from here and trying to catch the side of that building. The wiggles are perfectly acceptable. You can do the wiggles, but they become smaller as they get away from you. They become larger as they approach you. So the wiggles back here can be very, very little wiggles, and then they become bigger as they come towards you. Because the water is changing its look as it comes near you. Naturally, things in a distance are smaller. Same thing with waves. The waves in the distance, little rivulets or waves or little disturbances on the water, will be smaller in the distance. Apparently, what is being picked up here is part of this pale beach, but near the shore, one must be sure to capture the darkness of a shoreline, because tides leave the bottom of the creek or any body of water darker. All right, we have this window must be attended to. It is dark enough to cast a real reflection in the water. This one probably also, so is the other one, but very subtle, and I'm going to maybe unpaint those in a minute. And then this fellow is going to find itself reflected as well. And it's fascinating when you're out there and you realize what are those long reflected things, and they turn out to be the windows that you never really suspected would have cast reflections, but they in fact do. Now, here we are with the business of the pilings, the reflections of the pilings are now going to give you the final real understanding of the reflections in this painting. Of course, you use the placement of the pilings from your sketch. And if there's a piling in this one is narrow, so you make it narrow. This is also another narrow one. And then the bigger one on the outside is bigger. It's fatter, wider, heavier. Now I'm going to take another brush and I'm going to sort of unpaint that, or pull it down so that it is subtle and disappears. These also, the ones in the back, also are going to play a part, but very much in a much less obvious manner. There they are. And this is why this scene is so interesting to me as a study in reflections, because it is so mysterious why these things happen this way. Now they disappear, and it sort of plays around with the building and its platform and then its shadowy side. And we have also, I noticed that the door, the gate that closes this door, is open and tells a story that this is a homemade gate with a sort of a funny little lumber arrangement. It's apparently just a gate that is left open. We have now 6:45. I have missed not speaking to the viewers. I always think that's a great deal of fun. But I have my wonderful ability to be a chattering magpie comes in handy when I have to do this, when I have to talk a great deal continuously. Let me take a few moments now to do this water thing in the foreground. I mentioned before that it becomes darker as it comes towards you. A sort of a phenomenon which it has a little bit of mauve in it too. Water is not always blue, believe me. I was in Virginia this weekend and looked at the water of the Holston River, and believe me, that water is not blue. It reflects the mountains, which are dark and they're green, and there was virtually no vestige of blue at all in the river, except the little rivulets at the top that were catching the light and the reflection of the sky. So, whatever the experts tell you about water being blue all the time, it's not so. Now, let's for one moment now watch what happens when you have a few tricks up your sleeve. You can run this across and it becomes an indication that water is playing on the surface, the wind is playing on the surface of this water. And that's how you must do this after you have painted, you have prepared the ground for it. And if you do it too much, it becomes, well, it's corny if you do it too much. Now, as you can see, the water has become darker as it's come towards you, and my sketch tells me that because there is a a land mass behind here. The water has now turned, the reflections in the water are now quite green and dark because of this, oops, I've got to get some more blue in there, because of the ridge of water of green above it. And so we have here a very nice and cooperative color arrangement in the water, whereby you're catching this ridge in the background. For some reason or another, my sketch has got a wonderful kind of a brilliant yellow thing. It must be that thing that is playing somewhere in the water as well. That meadow of green, of brilliant green grasses. Either that, or there is a lot of growth here at the shore's edge. Now you see, I want to repeat again, I'm not using any prepared green at all. This is all the playing with yellow and blue. And of course mauve, some sienna to temper the greens and to keep them as subtle as possible. I did not use any Prussian blue for reasons that Prussian blue is impossible to control. So unless you really can understand how to handle Prussian blue, throw it out. Just or put it in a drawer somewhere and never take it on a painting trip. It's wonderful to tint a gallon of paint. If you want a blue room, all you need is about 4 drops in a gallon of paint. You've got the bluest blue you can possibly get. So Prussian blue is to be avoided, but the ultramarine blue is indispensable, especially when you're doing water scenes. And I'm going to carry on the pale quality of the water in this foreground here by reinstituting some of this muted blue. Too bright, too bright. Let's just see if we can, well, no, it's just too bright. Let's just get that down. You have to practice what you preach. And if you say that it should be darker, then make it darker. Now, of course, there is the need to blend. That's why oils become so 10, okay? Oils are the most successful blenders. It is difficult to get this kind of look with tempera colors. It is actually impossible to get this kind of look with acrylics. I don't use acrylics, but I have used them once and threw them out. Except that they're nice to decorate furniture with, but certainly not to do what you might call fine arts or painting of any kind. Now, we have a ridge, we have a bank up here, which must be dealt with, and that bank is apparently got some very wonderful dark places because the tide seems to be sort of out. And this is a combination of purple, some very intense purple, which is called ultramarine violet, available in the art stores. And it's indispensable if you want to work with greens. You must always have some brilliant purple at your disposal when you are working landscapes. Landscapes without purple tend to be less than right. I mean, if you want to study the classics, go to the library and get a book. The landscape painters, the great landscape painters to study are Thomas Cole, an American painter, a man called Kensett, Kensett. Of course, the great landscape painters of the contemporary and more, well, what do you call it, impressionistic is Van Gogh and Gauguin, all very impressionistic but very beautiful and a great deal to learn. Then there is a man called Seurat, who was a French impressionist, and his paintings are done with dots. Just wonderful, wonderful, complex dotting. If he wanted a green, he would put one dot of yellow next to a dot of blue, and he did it so well that you would have sworn you were looking at green, and there isn't any green anywhere. It's blue and yellow. So these are the masters to look for. Rembrandt did not paint as many landscapes as I think he should have. He was more interested in portraiture, and so his aren't. And then, of course, Rubens was interested in the human figure. And Michelangelo was an expert in the human figure as well. So there are some wonderful landscape painters to be conjured with. Now, I'm going to do this foreground here of this bush. I'm going to use, well, I think I'll use that nice nylon brush. And I'm going to make it very much in a silhouette arrangement, purple, yellow, and blue for this great clump of beach grass. It is quite tall, it's quite large, I mean very prominent because it's the most foreground item in the picture. And it can be, yeah, okay, fine, good. It can be, this can get more detail than anything else in the painting because it's in the foreground. If you decide to do detail, you must use thinned paint, a very thin striping brush, and reduce the paint to an ink-like consistency. I believe that I have a brush that will probably be able to do that, but put it all in this way first, and then just because you want to concentrate a little bit on detail. You would not paint every single blade. You would just give a feeling about it, and here I do have a small enough brush to be able to give you some idea. You have to use a thinner, and you have to reduce the paint to a nice ink-like consistency, and I'll make sure you get a nice close-up of this, and I'll show you how you can get just the subtle insinuation of this grass. Just a few, nothing overdone, because this is not a botanical study. This is an impression of this clump of grass, and so you would certainly not. And you do it in the pale colors, and it's a practice. It's a practice thing that you and the tops of the grass catch the light and give you that wonderful. Oh, it's very.